Hello, everyone. This is recording number 4 for Aristotle, a class on the Nicomachean Ethics. So far, we talked about the very first claim that Aristotle makes, namely that there is precisely one ultimate end, eudaimonia, happiness, a well-lived human life, which is the final end that we pursue in all of our smaller scale actions. And you might think, why does a treatise on normative ethics start with a claim that could look like it is a proposal in the theory of action or in the analysis of human motivation? So somehow we need to get from the claim that action works in such and such a way to a proposal about how we should live or something normative. And Aristotle makes that transition by arguing that, well, it might be the case that we all agree that there is one final end, namely eudaimonia, happiness. And nevertheless, we could disagree on what kind of life it is that actually makes us happy. So someone might say, I'm happy if I pursue pleasure. And someone else might say, I'm happy when I'm rich. And we do not yet have any resources to assess any such substantive normative views on what a good human life looks like. Now, in a sense, all of the rest of the Nicomachean Ethics gives an answer to that question. But two really important premises are put forward already in Book 1. And one is that human beings have a function, and the other is that we have two kinds of capacities in our soul that lend themselves to being active in ways where we can attain excellence. And jointly, these two ideas give Aristotle the tools to distinguish between the virtues of thinking on the one hand and the virtues of character on the other hand. And that distinction is going to be absolutely crucial for his proposals in the rest of the Nicomachean Ethics. So, how does that work? The function argument in chapter 7 of the Nicomachean Ethics starts with the premise that the good of something resides in its function. For example, the good of the eyes resides in their characteristic activity, namely seeing. A good eye is an eye that sees well. So, spelled out in this way, the premise that the good of something resides in its function supplies us already with quite a lot. Namely, on the one hand, this notion of a function in Greek that is ergon, and we can kind of think of this as a distinctive or characteristic activity, and the idea that one can perform one's characteristic activity in better or worse ways, and the idea that something is an excellent instance of the kind of thing that it is if it performs its distinctive activities excellently well. And in some sense, that is already giving you a lot of what you need in order to understand Aristotle's ethics. So, next question, do human beings have a function? Aristotle does not offer really a kind of extended argument here. He offers instead what scholars call a rhetorical argument. He just says, well, should eyes and ears and so on and so forth have a function and human beings be mere do-nothings? Surely not. So, with this kind of hand-wavy rhetorical move, we introduce the premise that human beings have a function. And throughout the tradition, some ethicists who are not Aristotelians have been kind of offended by this, thinking that, what does it mean to say that human beings have a function? But if you think of function, as I suggested earlier, namely in terms of distinctive activity, the kind of off-puttingness of the idea arguably goes away, because now we are saying, well, human beings have some activity, or in the plural, activities that are distinctive of us. So that is the idea that Aristotle pursues. And he pursues this by what is called an argument by elimination, where he says, well, what are the sorts of things that we can consider activities in the soul? And he uses soul here in a really broad way, where everything that is related to us being alive belongs to the soul. And he says, well, there are vegetative functions in the soul, such as growing, but they are not going to be distinctive of human beings because we share them with plants. There are also perceptual activities, but they are also not distinctive of human beings because we share them with animals. So what's left? And now the proposal is that what is really distinctive for human beings is a practical sort of life in accordance with reason. And that is a difficult idea to unpack. And the function argument alone, or chapter 7 of the Nicomachean Ethics, even though it says a lot more that I'm not going to address here, does not fully unpack this. Hence, I'm going to, as it were, jump ahead, setting aside more interesting details that come up in chapter 7, and instead we look at chapter 13. There, Aristotle engages in a kind of sketch of the human soul. And that is going to help us understand something that he says in a kind of compressed way in chapter 7, namely that, well, the sorts of things that have something to do with human reason are, on the one hand, reasoning, strictly speaking, thinking. But then also there's something in the soul that is able to obey reason, to listen to reason. And now in chapter 13, by giving us a kind of sketch of the human soul, we can, Aristotle helps us understand that better. In chapter 13, the proposal is that there are three, as it were, principles in the human soul. One is the vegetative principle. Those are not principles in the sense of axioms, but you could think of them as three, ways of being alive. One is, again, the vegetative principle, which includes things like growing and so on. And, well, that is not related to reason in any kind of way. So that's not going to be a candidate for what we can do in better or worse ways, such that by doing it well, we are excellent. We are not, as it were, in a position to think, well, I'm going to, let me find out how I can grow well, or let me stop growing, or anything like this. These vegetative functions are simply, as it were, not in the reach of reason. But then there are two other kinds of dimensions to the human soul. One, reason, strictly speaking, thinking. But then there's also what we may call desiderative attitudes, desire and aversion. And that, according to Aristotle, is somehow reason responsive, as today we might call this. It can listen to reason. It can be shaped and molded and habituated by reason. And that is the kind of starting point for Aristotle's account of the virtues of character, because it is going to turn out that the virtues of character are well habituated, desiderative attitudes, or at least that is a kind of starting point for how we can think about them. So at the end of book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, we have the tools to distinguish between two kinds of excellences: excellences in reasoning or thinking, and excellences of character. And that distinction is going to be extraordinarily important for the rest of the book.